Good afternoon, Chair and friends. I'd like to present this paper on a contested topic, actually, and a really important topic as well. And the title which I've kept is Issues of Educating People, Assaying National Education Policies of India. I would really get into, in fact, now the aspect of education, its policies, aspects of, in fact, say, governance, and anthropological, say, analysis into educating people of any society or any nation. So, friends, that takes us to look into the relation between anthropology and education, where anthropology definitely, in fact, as we all know, gets into the analysis of each and every aspect of society, especially enculturation, involves in the sense formal education as well. And yeah, anthropological applications have been provided us with a critical analysis of these key institutions called as education. And we do have a super specialization called as education anthropology, which looks into several aspects into education, where we find that, say, educating people in a multicultural setup and the aspects of multiculturalism, and then people who belong to different, say, cultural backgrounds, getting imparted into education, and then the role of several, say, like in the sense, culturally relevant, say, pedagogy. And of course, in each culture, we know that there are several native methods of enculturation. So these have the areas where we have seen across the world that many educational anthropologists have involved in. And yes, they are interested also in imparting education of the marginalized sections and peripheral communities within these culturally plural contexts, actually. So, friends, we also know further that anthropologists also are interested, especially in emphasizing the structural inequalities and the power dimensions that also go in with regard to, say, the several aspects of imparting education to the people. So therefore, this particular, say, paper looks into those aspects very, very, critically, and we take India as a kind of a area where that India has a very, very culturally distinct kind of a society with its unique, say, aspects. Then, yeah, we have a kind of a situation where, like in a sense, mass education, as elsewhere in the world, has been critical in changing the balance of power in the society. And the society in India, as we know, is unique for its system of, say, a system of like graded inequality, which has resulted in banning of education for the majority. So the system itself, in fact, has created a kind of an organized ignorance, and the oppressed majority of this country, they have been, say, denied education, and several codes, legal, moral codes and all, they have kept majority people away from the field of education. And yeah, there were several attempts, in fact, now to set the score right. There were several movements of education, to be very particular, as we see in ancient India. Even Buddha himself was one of the major, say, promoter of education in the language of the people. He used Pali, Ardhamagadi, not the Sanskrit, the language of the oppressor in that sense, actually. So there were several movements of education. We know particularly from the 20th century movement, social movement like Jyotirao Phule, Savitribai, then Narayan Guru, Ayodhyadas, Periyar, and including in fact Dr. Ambedkar. They all have led several movements for social transformation, which involved imparting education to all the people of this country without any kind of a bias. So therefore, the sort of alienation of education itself has been a unique feature in Indian context. And with the Constitution of India, a democratic Constitution of India has come up, and this Constitution has been hailed as one of the great blueprint of a social revolution, which has created a kind of a class called as a backward class. Those people, in fact, now the oppressed majority who have been systematically, like in a sense, excluded from the field of education. And the Constitution termed this majority population, who almost constitute 85% of the population, as socially and educationally backward classes. So that has been the agenda of the Constitution. But what we see in implementation, in fact, now is that there has been a legal legitimacy in India for getting education, in fact, for all the people, all the citizens. But what we see, like in a sense, educating people has become cultural illegitimacy, actually. So this is a kind of an incompatibility that we see. And what we look into basically is a kind of a kind of a critical survey into the policies for educating people of India for over 7 decades. So friends, as we also know, and even following Michel Foucault, we understand that the ideology, or in fact now like kind of the kind of a say power in the elite groups, say always try to control the majority. And in India, education, in fact, now has been one of the instruments of such control. So we also know that the value of education for both the privileged and the underprivileged, in fact, is of good value. But there's a different perspective. See, it is not the same for the privileged and the underprivileged. For the underprivileged, education, in fact, now is an instrument of social change as well as personal mobility. And in fact, the rise of some underprivileged people in this public life in the recent decades, in fact, now definitely would be ascribed only to education. Therefore, the underprivileged, in fact, in India have high stakes in education, actually. So, but as we see, friends, for the last 7 decades, we will look into some of the stats. In fact, now I've taken higher education, other things and all. But if you go with any kind of statistics, it is apparent that the targeted section, especially the socially and educationally backward classes, the rate of, in fact, now literacy among them is substantially lower than the other minority sections of this community, those privileged minority sections. We can go for any number of statistics, and we can only get, in fact, now the kind of an understanding that the reality is that the socially and educationally backward classes still remain, like in the sense to be imparted with the education. We will go to some kind of, I've selected few stats here, and education, especially the privatization of higher education in this country, it remained very, very positive only for the privileged sections. And if you go into the states, I'm just using the All India Survey on Higher Education 2019, it shows that in almost all the states of this country, higher education is thoroughly privatized to the extent, like in a sense, the 82% of higher education basically is privatized in Andhra Pradesh, the state of Andhra Pradesh, which we are talking about here, followed by the Telangana, it is 80%. 78% of education institutions imparting higher educations in Uttar Pradesh are privatized. Tamil Nadu also has 77%. These are quite woofing figures actually. And if you look at the social category wise, teaching and non-teaching staff, with students, of course, we have the same kind of figures we can quote from different. Even with regard to the teaching and non-teaching staff, the All India Survey on Higher Education from the Ministry of Human Resources, it shows these skewed figures in favor of, in fact, now the general category actually. And yeah, if you also look into the social categories, gender, religious groups among the same teaching and non-teaching staff, yeah, the same report also shows us the similar kind of a trend. And if you look into these premier institutions, yeah, like IIMs and IITs, the situation, in fact, now is much worse. So of the 8,856 sanctioned faculty strength, nearly 4,876, in fact, now go for the general category. The another major section in this country is the other backward caste. They are represented only by 329, and the scheduled castes, they're represented by 149 members, and just 21 are from the scheduled tribe community. So these figures we get, in fact, now from the Ministry of Human Resource Department, and this data has been provided by the Minister of HRD to a question raised by a member of Parliament in the Parliament actually. So then what we see is out of 23 IITs, nearly 15 IITs do not have any representative from the scheduled tribes. They are, in fact, the celebrated IITs like Bombay, Kanpur, Kharagpur, and on. And out of the 18 IIMs in the country, yeah, 16 do not have a representation of scheduled tribe. 12 IIMs, in fact, now do not have anybody from the scheduled tribe, and just seven had no OBCs. That means the majority population of this country do not get represented in the portals of higher education. So, and yeah, same the situation with the IIMs as well. So friends, this being the situation, and what are the reasons for the poor performance of education? I have jotted down, in fact, now basing on several research studies, these few points. One is defective policies, and if at all the policies are better, implementation is one you have say is wanting, and the second is thrust only on accessibility. See, the education policy, any education policy program contains three important aspects: accessibility, equity, and equality in the field of education. But unfortunately, what we see in the last 70 years, different governments, in fact, now the implementation concentrated only on accessibility. We see figures only on GER, gross enrollment ratio, and not much talk has been done on equity of education or quality of education as such. And when you come to equity of education, we see somewhere, like in a sense, the government of India itself has encouraged unequal education by recognizing more than 16 different boards of schools. So those who have resources, they themselves, in fact, now get a better kind of an education with a better syllabi and a curriculum. And people who are underprivileged, they have to satisfy themselves with the state syllabi. So there is a kind of unequal kind of an education. On the quality of education, not much work has been done so far actually. So the other is, in fact, with regard to teachers, yeah, the aspect of quality of teaching, and at the same time orientation of teachers towards an inclusive education. This important aspect, in fact, now in a culturally diverse say background has not been given much thrust in the trainings. And finally, low expenditure on education. It is much alarming actually. India spends very, very less on education. So let us look into these aspects a little more detailedly. So if we take one particular aspect of, in fact, now like imparting education, we see the shifting goals of governments across. In the drafting committee of the Constitution, the chairman, Dr. Ambedkar, has introduced, he has drafted Article 23 in the draft of the Constitution as the fundamental right to education for all children between up to 14 years of age. And this particular proposal has been thoroughly contested and opposed by the members of the drafting committee. Actually, there are certain members, if you go into the drafting committee, the recordings of the drafting committee, they said, if every children goes to school, who will work in the fields? These are the things, in fact, which has happened in the debates of the drafting of the constitution, constitutional debates, actually. And the subcommittee headed by Sardar Patel, they have suggested reducing the age of the free and compulsory education to 0 to 11%. So Dr. Ambedkar has to argue that it's between 11 and 14. That is the crucial age where many children, they end up in farms or factories. So therefore, my dear friends, within this kind of a discourse, the Constituent Assembly finally allowed this particular education to be only in the directive principles of the state policy, Article 45. And friends, in the whole Constitution of India, this is the only article which has a time frame. No other article in the Constitution has any time frame, actually. So this Article 45 says, within 10 years of the promulgation of the Constitution, every child up to the age of 14 years shall get free and compulsory education by the state. So therefore, that has been, in fact, now a kind of a temporal compulsion by the government, but implementation, it did not happen. So that shows the motive or the kind of underlying understanding, in fact, now with the educacy, more particularly those who administer education. So that is the reason why, had that been implemented from 1950 to 1960, probably within the 10 years, the children, in fact, now up to 14 years would have got their education, say, like in a sense, maybe up to seventh or 8th or 9th standard. But that didn't happen. The first ever commission, education commission, Kothari Commission, it has understood this particular fact, and it has pegged that kind of a goal to 1976. And the next national policy in education, 1968, it said, it further said, at least, in fact, up to 5 years, 5th standard, by 1956, probably that would be the next deferred target. That also did not happen. And 1986 National Policy on Education, which also is called as Operation Blackboard, it further pegged that goal, said that at least up to class 8th, say by 1992, probably we'll see that said, in fact, now is implemented, which did not happen actually. The next policy of education, 1992, it said before 21st century, probably we will try to do that. That also did not happen. And the next education policy came with Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. So Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan has kept several targets, and it said by 2001, all children must be in the school. By 2002, 2003, all girls should be in the school. And yeah, you can see by 2003, 100% enrollment should happen. But that also did not happen. Yeah. And 2009, we have right to education. Thereafter, the government of India, in fact, now, it took away the target actually. It said, now we have given a fundamental right, and it is the duty of the citizens to implement that right. So therefore, we don't put any target. There is no target put 2009. And even 2016 and 2019, the recent national education policies also did not bother to put a kind of a target. So therefore, that has been the scene. And moreover, in 2009, Article 51A, Clause K has been brought in, transferring the responsibility of educating children onto the parents from the government. So this has been the scenario in India. And of course, the new education policy of 2019, friends, if you go that 484-page long educational policy of the 21st century, and it said in its vision, on the 3rd page itself, it said, India-centered education system. And what do you mean by that? Do you mean, in fact, like denying the majority, perpetuating inequality in education? But this policy, as you see, my dear friends, it ignored caste completely and views the social backwardness of the socially and educationally backward classes purely as economical. It has taken away the constitutional term itself. It did not mention the term socially and educationally backward classes, but it used other terms like socially marginalized, economically marginalized. It's a kind of a very, very.
Yes, solidarity, one for another.
Professor Dan Barno, please mute your mic, please. Okay, anyway. So, if you come to the other aspect of, say, this particular policy, it has been a kind of a centralization. The National Education Commission headed by the Prime Minister, it will completely, in fact, now put the education system of the country just into the ruling party's hands. That we have seen, and it also provides exit after class 5, and it does not bar child labor. So there are very, very serious implications into this kind of a policy. And yes, it is allowing a child to enter into the vocational or even family kind of a say kind of enterprises after the age of 10. So this further reinforces the caste-based occupations and then economic exploitation, which also, in fact, now tantamount to the violation of the children's rights. So the word representation, in fact, now it has been mentioned only just one, and that too saying that in the private education institutions, this representation called as reservation need not be followed. Just for that, in fact, now it has been kept out there. And yeah, so I'll try to do that. So if you look into the other aspects of the national education policy, friends, there is no discourse basically on gender and the issues of gender. What we understand basically from this is that this policy basically, friends, talk about say so yeah, I just try to cover it between this particular thing. So the point is, this educational policy basically say it also talks about say two important things, in fact, now that I want to say share with you. It is full of verbose, talking about 21st century level of education. But if you look into the aspect of higher education, and when it is talking about, like, in a sense, great say 21st century knowledge sharing thing and all, but if you refer to point 15.13, it talks about, in fact, creating the classrooms with full furniture, working toilets. It talks about blackboards. That's the 21st century national education policy, actually. And if anybody, it also talks about, in fact, efficient, energized, in fact, committed faculty. But if you look into that particular policy, I also, in fact, noted, but very clearly pointed out, saying that the same point 15, it talks about all research entrants. Compulsorily, they will have to say get into the say, like, in a sense, teaching. It talks about all research entrants should get into teaching, and they should put in specified number of say working hours. I will read it out. Point 15.5.1. It says, I quote, all fresh PhD entrants, irrespective of discipline, will be required to have taken 8 credit courses in teaching. They must also have a minimum number of hours of actual teaching experience gathered through teaching assistantships and other means. That means, if suppose in Andhra University, 1,000 research scholars, if they start teaching, and there is no necessity for a recruitment of teaching faculty as such. So you have those kind of implementations, actually. And that is the reason why Amartya Sen was saying education policies encourage skilled but uncritical subservient footfall soldiers for the global market. And he said, nowhere in the world university elementary education system has achieved without the state assuming the primary responsibility. Noam Chomsky, we know pretty well, he said, the trend across the world, especially in fact now, it says that they are not building up communities. They are building only malls. They are not creating citizens. They are only, in fact, now creating consumers. So that is the kind of thing that's going on. And especially if you go to the curriculum, and then NCERT position paper 2010, it declares, I quote, in India, curriculum and the content of education has been central to the process of reproduction of caste, class, cultural, and patriarchal domination and subordination, and aimed at indigenization, resulted in the Brahminization as a key defining feature of the curriculum. So that's the NCERT position paper itself saying that the kind of a curriculum, in fact, in this country is trying to reinforce the old inequalities. It doesn't include, in fact, now, like in a sense, mass educators and anti-caste patriarchy, anti-hegemonic discourses of Phule, Ayutthada's, Periyar, and Ambedkar, but includes Gandhi, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, Tagore, Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, Madan Mohan Malaviya, so on and so forth. And the gender perspective is completely missing. It's full of male stereotype, actually. It doesn't, in fact, no, it doesn't talk about the serious problems of this particular society. There is some sort of a caste blindness, actually, into the educational policy and its curriculum. And the pedagogy, in fact, now, of this oppressed majority is not, in fact, now promoting to, like, in a sense, equality. There should be, who should decide the education for this country? Anybody who, in fact, now tries to draft in a diverse and hierarchical society, all sections of society should participate in the critical decisions, and the prerogative of one section of having power to shape the future of the society should be questioned, actually. But that the scope, that kind of a bracket has not been given, especially with regard to teachers. Actually, there are several researchers. Probe to 1999, Mazumdar 2001, Ramachandran et al. 2004. They emphasize saying that social attitudes and community prejudices, they play an important role in determining the ability and willingness of the teachers to empathize with the children and teach them fraternity and bring them towards inclusive education in the classroom. That's a major cultural hurdle in this country, basically. So even the Anil Sadgopal, he writes, the suspect of the role of the civil society organizations, and most of these organizations for their funding depend upon the domestic corporates and international foundations which follow the neoliberal agenda of education, which does not care about the local cultural aspects, which ban or, in fact, discourage education for the majority. And we see for the last 7 decades, there are, in fact, the majority people who have been imparted education, majority of them are trained as hands, just workers. And few of them who are fortunate, they're trained as minds. And if you also look into the expenditure on education, I have taken the figures from 2014-15 to 2017. The expenditure, in fact, now the percent of GNI, I just want to show you, it went down. It went down from, in fact, now 6.15 in 2014-15 to just 3.17 actually. So that means, my friends, year after year, the spending on education is going very, very drastically down. And the world average on spending on education basically is 6% of the GDP. And as you can see, India has come down from 1.6% to just 0.6%. So state is, in fact, now moving away from education. In this kind of a scenario, friends, when we talk about youth development, India has majority of youth. 65% of the population of this country are below the age of 35. And youth development, in fact, involves education, health and well-being, employment and opportunity of the youth, civic participation, and political participation. In these kinds of figures, the Commonwealth Secretariat website, it in fact, in its global youth development indices, India stands 133 among 183 countries. Even Nepal is at 77, Bhutan is 69, Sri Lanka is just 31. in the youth development indices, and India stands at 133rd place among 183. So what are we doing with this youth of this country? So that is the pertinent question that we know to get into. So the next point that we will look into is that there is a quandary of education over here. India's working force is about around 400 million, of which 40% are illiterates, 40% school dropouts, 80% are school, like in the sense, do not get education. The illiterates and dropout levels can be distinctively mapped to the failure of the Indian education system as the prime reason. So what is the advantage of democratic dividend that we have today? So friends, I have other things to talk about, but the question is, we have to see that India is developed into a civic nation based on the principles of equality, liberty, comity, and justice. It definitely requires an inclusive education. And that is the area where anthropologists need to work. And anthropology, if you look into anthropology and education in India, there is a paucity of research on the policy in general. There are, of course, several researches into education among the tribes. And the policies, in fact, now, say, which have been there for education for the tribes, there are certain anthropologists who worked on that area. But in general, we don't see many anthropologists working in that particular area. Does it refer to academic colonization? That's a pertinent question to be asked. So therefore, friends, there is every necessity and impending, in fact, no demand for engaged endeavors, especially from the anthropologists, to see India as a country, in fact, now where people are imparted with education, critical awareness, and who are capable of, in fact, now making democracy work, because they make up the democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor P.D.Satyapal Kumar sir, for your presentation and the contribution to the understanding of the education policy and the historical background of the education in India, and the ongoing justification of the inequalities in access to education for all people. So now due to time limitations, we are not allowing for questioning hour because another session is waiting, and sir has taken much time.
You can ask any questions. 5 minutes.
So yeah, okay, 5 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Sir,
Any
5
questions?
minutes. Is there any question from the virtual community or the present people present here?
I think yesterday onwards, I think students said there is no question is not coming, right?
Okay, if not, nobody is. There is one person posted a message.
Yeah. Mute all.
Okay. So, yeah, I'm going to end this meeting with your kind permission. Thank you, because nobody is asking question, and we have already crossed the time limit. Next, Dr. Kiran Jayaram sir is going to present, and because of the time constraints, it is midnight in the US, so he has sent a recorded message. So I'm going to play that recorded message for the virtual community and the people presented here. So I will take 1 or 2 minutes to do that. Kindly bear with me. If you have questions regarding the previous presentation by Professor Satyapal Kumar sir, you can ask him by his email and phone contact. So he's our ready, available professor to respond to the questions. Thanks.
Good day. My name is Kiran Jayaram. I'm professor of anthropology at the University of South Florida. I want to thank Dr.Pedarattaiah, Gadde, and the Department of Anthropology for the sponsors and those unnamed but unforgettable workers, ladies and gentlemen. I truly wish I could attend in person, but both pandemic and parental obligations limit my engagement to virtual realm. As an introduction, I'll start by saying in his introduction to the 2001 collection of essays on American anthropologists, and then professor of anthropology and director of the Center for Public Dr.Kiran framed it in substance.
Kanan dulu ya, kanan, masan, apa tuh? Kalau le कितनों क्या बोली? Andhra कितना ले कितना कितने? अरे आपको orang ni je cakap pun di sini. Ini aja kok jadi ini kita di Chandra Murmu, kalau mesti pergi dah ni, kalau pun tinggal dalam sana, mana? Chandra कैसे सुनता है तो? आप ये नहीं सुनते? Andhra
Issues like climate change, religious extremism, ultranationalism, and xenophobic sentiments appear to affect anthropological training to get more involved. Indeed, this is presumably what applied anthropology is all about. However, it is not clear when the application does. I argue that it
ఇది మైక్ ఆన్ చేస్తే ఇక్కడ పెడతా ఏ బాబు మైక్ ఆన్ చేస్తారు కొంచెం
After briefly discussing the dichotomy between academic and applied anthropology, I provided ethnographic vignettes from several of my research projects to demonstrate possible nodes on a timeline for application. Assaying gives perspective on dynamics that must be considered in any discussion of applied anthropology. Now, before I begin, let me define anthropology as use of the discipline of anthropology, meaning this space and time, including evolutionary origins and contemporary diversity, to change people's lives. It is arguably, this term arguably includes or is in conversation with what has been called action anthropology by Charles Sachs, activist anthropology by Charles Hale, decolonized anthropology by Faye Harrison, engaged anthropology by Seth Lowe and Gary, practical anthropology by Boleslav Malinowski, public anthropology by Borowski and Trevor Brisson, or perhaps even an anthropology for the future by Margaret Mead. Experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic from my place in the United States, I believe that anthropology is the best way to understand the world's problems, a necessary step towards true change. In fact, that's an argument I make when I'm teaching my introductory to cultural anthropology courses. However, I also take to heart John Embry's caution about anthropology from so many years ago, being that, quote, true path towards salvation of the world. We should be careful about taking anthropology as being the true path towards salvation, because similar claims are put forth by engineers, scientists, and ministers of the gospel. Now, on histories of anthropologies and applied anthropologies. For the next few minutes, I ask for a slight indulgence regarding a history of anthropology. The reason being is that it displays a national bias toward the US, though I will attempt to temper it slightly. For one, I would like to have first consulted Shankar-Guha's racial bias of the caste system in India, which he wrote for his PhD in anthropology from Harvard in 1923. Or Panchanan Mitra's History of American Anthropology, which he wrote for his PhD in psychology at Yale in 1930. First, a distinction should be made between the modern professionalized anthropology model, which often marks the PhD, at least in the United States, as a legitimate credential in the history of his ethnological and early anthropological work. So those two separate moments. But thus, we can see scholarship over a decade before Franz Boas granted the first Columbia University doctoral degree in anthropology to Alfred Program. For example, Anthony Freeman from Haiti wrote his major work, translated in English, on the equality of the races and positivist anthropology. In response to and in detailed critique of the racist thinking pervasive throughout the Anthropological Society of Paris, the list frameworks of law. Indian anthropological discourse dates to the 19th century. And even Franz Boas, considered the founder of US anthropology, earned his doctoral degree in physics. Only later did he assume the role of anthropologist, which meant for him to focus on, quote, problems related to the physical and mental life of mankind and found in varying forms of society. A second, when considering the dichotomy between applied and pure or regular anthropology, it is important to keep Boas's intellectual orientation. For him, there was only the former. Yet his endeavor was deeply linked to provide the solid data that countered existing misinformed positions and critiqued views on this history. Boas took issue with the racialization of physical anthropology and anthropometry, and his work demonstrated that a cultural context affected the growth of people, thus discounting a fixed notion of race. Yet perhaps the most visible division between anthropology and applied anthropology is seen in the existence in the United States of two major professional associations, the American Anthropological Association and the Society for Applied Anthropology. The former dates to 1902 and the latter to 1941. The split due in part to an intellectual difference regarding the role of anthropologists in government. Yet this organization distinction obscures the matter. In fact, the dichotomy between anthropology and applied anthropology does not completely hold. In the US, this distinction has been more of the foundation of epithets and intellectual differences. As someone with a doctoral degree that includes the words applied anthropology, I simply contend that any anthropological research that addresses a significant socially relevant problem is applied anthropology. Yet I recall as a graduate student how my colleagues and mentors at its so-called pure program showed disdain for applied research. Outside of the US, as been pointed out in several anthropological traditions in Africa by a great book by Barangui, Mills, and Babacar, the line between applied and non-applied is often untenable. Within the Caribbean, that I'm very familiar with, contemporary scholars in Haiti and the Dominican Republic are usually so grossly underpaid at universities that they must take whatever outside work, whether it's contracting, consulting, or multiple part-time teaching positions to meet their socially necessary material needs. Now, turning to examples of anthropological applications, and the question of this paper, I draw upon examples from my research to help create an understanding of when anthropology is or could be applied. These first examples deal with the moment when the researcher conceptualizes and designs a project. For my doctoral research, I was primarily interested in learning about the population of people from Haiti living in the Dominican Republic, the neighboring country on the island, respectively. Differences between people from the two nations are often overaccentuated for political means, that is to say, anti-immigrant xenophobic tropes, despite the existence of many blended families over generations along the border and throughout the country. During my pre-dissertation research in the Dominican Republic, I spent a brief time in the capital city and learned that despite the fact that Haitians had been living and working in the Dominican Republic cutting sugarcane for most of the 20th century, that industry was not robust enough to attract the same number of immigrants by the early 21st century. Consequently, the changes in the national and global political economy led me to abandon the idea of studying, quote, Haitians working in the sugarcane fields and embrace Haitians in urban areas. Now, fixing the population or even a geographic area isn't part of research design, right? The research question needed more, and at that moment, I understood the historical, political, economic context that rendered the population novel. But I needed more, so a Dominican colleague took me to a neighborhood called Little Haiti, where many poor Haitians stayed when they first arrived in the Dominican Republic. There were also poor Dominicans living in the neighborhood, interestingly. The same person also alerted me to the increasing number of Haitians studying at Dominican universities. So, seeing what I considered a class difference, I began designing a research project informed by existing scholarship to help me understand the lives of and livelihoods of lower class workers and of university students from Haiti. Any problem they faced would require an understanding of their lives beyond what statistics and news reports provided. Hence, I conceived my research as a socially relevant and thus applied project. I conducted a second problem-based research project beginning in 2016 on the lives of Haitian mango harvesters. In the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, which was one of the worst disasters in modern history, people and institutions from around the world rushed to provide so-called help and hope to Haiti. The Coca-Cola company partnered with other organizations to invest in Haiti to increase mango exportation as a way to better people's lives after the seismic event. To develop my research project, I asked a simple question. How is the increase in mango exportation affecting the lives of the Haitian harvesters? This inquiry held clear social relevance, as it would provide some insight into how effective post-disaster aid and development projects really were. Sadly, the project's results only looked good on paper. In reality, the push towards export-oriented harvesting led to devaluation of women's labor. Such a finding could easily be applied by someone. Now, what my doctoral research and my mango project had in common was that the process of developing a research project and creating a research design required a broad consideration of human experience and conceptualization along the anthropological lines of methodology and theory. And this was independent research, so I was not constrained in what I could ask or what I could pursue. It was problem-based that was applied, yet the application would fall to others. And that's those situations. I had no illusions, and I made sure to clarify this to all my research participants that I was not the spearhead for a major social betterment project. The process of project design, applying anthropological disciplinary insight. The process of project design included applying anthropological disciplinary insight, but the researcher did not endeavor to make any change in people's lives based upon findings. So, in two other experiences of field work, they reinforced when anthropology may be applied with it all. This is in the use of anthropological knowledge. So for several years, I worked as a research consultant in Haiti for the World Bank. Effectively, this required me to collaborate with an economist or two who was tasked with finding information about people's lives beyond what their statistics revealed. As an anthropologist, I was responsible for providing this explanation by conducting field work and producing a report. For one project, my team wanted to understand why families were sending their children to primary school for the first time after the age of 6. Late enrollment is what they call it. First, I developed a rough interview instrument, which was vetted by the World Bank staff to ensure that I asked what they wanted to know. Next, I organized a team of researchers in Haiti comprised of Haitian university students and trained them on conducting interviews and carried out the work. A similar process occurred regarding a project on children's understanding of the return on investment, the ROI, for different levels of schooling. When developing that interview guide, I repeatedly raised questions about how mechanical and irrelevant questions seemed. This did not matter, as the people at the bank had a project they needed to complete. We finished that project and I submitted both reports. Now, in a separate situation, I was hired by a major research institution to carry out research on conditions in post-earthquake Haiti. One project was on dynamics of land tenure, which was more historical and archival in nature. The other involved understanding levels of trust among community members and organizations in a watershed zone. I was one member of a team of 5 other US-based scientists who were conducting preliminary research before the institution began the major project in the area. And within a span of 2 weeks, I was expected to travel up to a remote section of Haiti, cover hundreds of square miles or kilometers, and assess who among that area you trusted more than others. Even though it was sparsely populated, conducting in-depth interviews in rugged mountainous territory required a sampling strategy that left much to be desired in terms of robust and perhaps even reliable or valid data. At the end of my research, though, I delivered the report. In it, I specifically mentioned problems related to the lack of cultural competency by the people designing the overall project and the other team members working in the area. One major concern of mine was that for the local populations, the watershed did not in any way define or correspond with an aspect of their lives. They didn't see the watershed as being a thing. It was an outside concept imposed because of the ecological orientation of the funding. Common to both my work on schooling and on community trust in the watershed of Haiti is that the fact that the funders implemented their ideas after I submitted the reports. In other words, I had conducted anthropological research and given results to decision makers, and they had taken action. So one would think my work had been put into practice. Although I hesitate in claiming that they applied my findings because, frankly, I know that despite my efforts, the cultural insensitivities were ignored. All my suggestions were dismissed, even if the economists with whom I spoke recognized that they were good ideas, but, quote, not likely to be acceptable according to the organization's bylaws. So, turning towards a discussion and conclusion, the ethnographic cases I provided here are a few of the thousands that could be examined from the ethnographic record. I'm not a historian of anthropology, so I cannot state how and when applications occurred in the 1960s Camelot Project, Cornell's Vigos Project, soil taxes were the Pat Roberts Intelligence Scholars Program, or the Human Terrain Systems Project. Certainly many anthropologists worked with the US Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the Central Intelligence Agency, of course, where anthropologists and anthropological types working with colonial administrators as well throughout the British Empire. Perhaps the research design, findings, and implementation were tightly linked so that anthropological knowledge was applied throughout the entire process. In my experience, however, it seems that the answer to when anthropology is applied has 3 answers. Number 1, in the conceptualization and design of research, that is methodologies, theories, and ethics. Number 2, in the use of knowledge generated from research, that is the practice. Word 3, not ever, it's never applied. So teasing apart the moments of application, as Borowski did, and regarding to the use of the term culture from the introduction as before or after research, this directs us to ask and answer other questions. What do we mean by applying? How can we train students and other researchers to design applied anthropological research? What are our ethical responsibilities once we conduct socially relevant research? What are the ethical and moral considerations for conducting research in an organization or with an organization for which one has significant differences of opinion? What about for organizations that are controversial, like the US military and the war in the Middle East? What should researchers do if the, quote, indigenous knowledge by Trevor Purcell that we integrate into our findings is ignored by our funding institutions? If we dare to imagine that we are working with a population in a decolonized, culturally sensitive, and engaged manner towards public betterment, how can we be certain that our research is not skewed towards the group's interests? As the first National Applied Anthropology Congress We know that we have many more moments at this event and later to discuss these and other questions. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, feel free to write me. My email is kjayaram@usf.edu.
Dear participants, if you have questions, because the speaker, because of the time constraints, he sent the recorded message. So if you have any questions, you can visit the website, University of South Florida, Department of Anthropology. Dr. Kiran Jayaram's email and everything will be there. So you can contact him, and he's a very nice man. All right. Thank you. I'm going to end this meeting because of the we need lunch break here for the participants who are participating physically here. And thank you for the virtual community, and the rest, we respect your time and interest in applied anthropology, and thank you so much.